Whispers of betrayal. The heavy rain drummed against the window, a rhythmic whisper of secrets carried by the wind. Ethan sat in the dimly lit living room, a glass of whiskey in his trembling hand. The ice cubes clinked as he swirled the liquid, his thoughts darker than the storm outside. He had always trusted Olivia, his wife of 10 years. She was his anchor, his sanctuary. But tonight, everything was unraveling. It started with a scent of foreign cologne lingering on Olivia's scarf. At first, Ethan dismissed it. Perhaps a colleague, a friend. But then came the late nights, the hushed phone calls, the distant glances. The gnawing suspicion grew until he could no longer ignore it. He had to know the truth. One evening, while Olivia was in the shower, Ethan did something he had sworn he would never do. He checked her phone. His pulse pounded as he scrolled through her messages. And then he saw it. "I can't wait to see you again. Last night was incredible." The text was from a number he didn't recognize. His breath hitched, his chest tightening. He clicked on the contact. No name. Just a string of messages, each one more damning than the last. Ethan's world tilted. His hands clenched into fists, the phone slipping from his grasp. The woman he had built his life around, the woman he had loved with every fiber of his being, was betraying him. But with whom? Determined to uncover the truth, Ethan hired a private investigator. A week later, the investigator returned with photos of Olivia, dressed in a crimson dress he had never seen before, sitting across from a man at an upscale restaurant. The way she leaned in, the way their hands touched, it was undeniable. Betrayal had a face. James Reynolds. Ethan recognized him instantly. A business associate. A man he had welcomed into his home on multiple occasions. The sting of the betrayal burned deeper, knowing that it wasn't just Olivia, it was someone he had trusted. Rage coiled within him like a venomous snake, but Ethan knew he couldn't confront them outright. No, he needed a plan. He needed to make them feel the same pain that now consumed him. The next few weeks, Ethan played the role of the loving husband, never letting on that he knew. He observed, he listened, he waited. And then, he struck. One evening, he suggested a weekend getaway to Olivia. "We've been so distant lately. Let's reconnect," he had said, watching her reaction closely. She hesitated but eventually agreed. The trip was set for the following Friday. That night, while Olivia was asleep, Ethan sent a message from her phone to James. "I need to see you. Meet me at our usual place on Friday night." James replied almost instantly, "Of course. I miss you." Ethan smirked. The trap was set. Friday arrived, and Olivia kissed Ethan goodbye as she left for a work meeting. But instead of heading out of town, Ethan followed her. She drove straight to a hotel. Ethan parked across the street, watching as James arrived moments later. They embraced, and Ethan felt something inside him snap. Instead of storming in, Ethan pulled out his phone and started recording. Every touch, every kiss captured. He wanted evidence. Not just for himself, but for what came next. That night, when Olivia returned home, Ethan was waiting. "How was your meeting?" he asked casually, sipping his whiskey. Olivia smiled, oblivious. "Exhausting." Ethan nodded, placing his phone on the table. "I bet." Then he pressed play. The color drained from Olivia's face as the video unfolded. Her lips parted, but no words came. The silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating. "Ethan, I don't," he cut her off, his voice eerily calm. "I trusted you, Olivia. I loved you. And this is how you repay me?" Tears welled in her eyes, but Ethan felt nothing. The love he once had for her had been buried beneath layers of betrayal and hurt. The divorce was swift and brutal. Ethan made sure Olivia walked away with nothing. But James wasn't as lucky. Ethan had connections, and within weeks, James's career crumbled. Deals fell through, investors pulled out, and his reputation was left in ruins. Months passed, and one evening, Ethan received an anonymous letter. The handwriting was delicate, familiar. "You thought it was over. But this is just the beginning." His blood ran cold. Olivia wasn't done yet. And neither was he. To be continued. Shattered illusions. The city lights flickered through the hotel window, casting elongated shadows across the lavish suite. Julia leaned against the balcony railing, her silk dress clinging to her frame as the cool night air whispered against her skin. She checked her phone, a message from her husband, Daniel. "Late meeting again. Don't wait up. Love you." A bitter smile curled on her lips. Love. What a fragile, deceptive word. She had believed in it once, clung to it like a lifeline. But love had become an illusion, one that shattered the moment she found the lipstick stain on his collar 2 months ago. It wasn't hers. At first, she had wanted to ignore it, to pretend it was nothing. But the signs multiplied: unexplained absences, the scent of unfamiliar perfume, the sudden distance in his touch. Julia wasn't a fool. Daniel was having an affair. The knowledge burned, but she wasn't going to be the devastated wife who crumbled. No. She had a plan. Tonight, she wasn't alone. A man stepped out from the shadows of the suite, a striking figure with piercing green eyes and an aura of quiet danger. His name was Adrian, and he was not just a stranger. He was someone who had been watching Daniel long before Julia suspected anything. "Are you sure about this?" Adrian's voice was smooth, calculated. "Once we start, there's no turning back." Julia met his gaze without hesitation. "I've never been more certain. He destroyed my trust. Now, it's my turn." Adrian nodded. He had been gathering evidence on Daniel for months. What Julia hadn't expected when she hired a private investigator was the tangled web of secrets he would uncover. Daniel wasn't just unfaithful, he was involved in something far darker. Business deals that didn't exist, hidden accounts, and connections to people whose names only appeared in hushed whispers. The affair? That was the least of Julia's concerns now. She poured herself a glass of wine, watching the city below. "Tomorrow is our anniversary," she murmured. "And I plan to give Daniel a night he'll never forget." The next evening, Julia dressed with meticulous care. A deep red gown, the color of betrayal, and a necklace Daniel had gifted her years ago before the lies. She arrived at the upscale restaurant where they had planned to celebrate, her heart pounding, not with love, but with the thrill of what was to come. Daniel was already there, looking effortlessly composed, as if he weren't leading a double life. He smiled as she approached, playing the role of the devoted husband perfectly. "Happy anniversary, darling." Julia returned the smile, but inside, she was counting down the minutes. Halfway through dinner, Adrian appeared. Not as a stranger, but as an old acquaintance Daniel had conveniently forgotten to mention. The tension at the table was thick enough to slice. "Adrian," Daniel finally said, his voice controlled but his eyes wary. "I didn't expect to see you here." Adrian smirked, swirling the whiskey in his glass. "Oh, I imagine you didn't. But then again, secrets have a way of revealing themselves." Julia leaned in, resting her chin on her hand. "Speaking of secrets, darling, there's something I need to tell you." Daniel's fork hovered midair. "What is it?" She slid a file across the table: documents, bank statements, photos. Everything. His affair. His illegal dealings. His lies. Daniel's face drained of color. "Julia, where did you get this?" She sipped her wine slowly. "Let's just say, while you were busy sneaking around, so was I." The silence stretched. And then, Adrian placed a small recording device on the table, pressing play. Daniel's own voice filled the air, confessing to crimes that, if exposed, would ruin him completely. Daniel swallowed hard. "You don't understand." "Oh, I understand perfectly," Julia interrupted, her voice sharp as glass. "You see, I thought the worst thing you could do was betray me with another woman. But then I realized your real betrayal wasn't in the bedroom. It was in the empire of lies you built around us." Adrian leaned back. "You have two options, Daniel. Either you walk away quietly and leave everything to Julia, or, well, let's just say the authorities will be very interested in this little compilation of ours." Daniel's jaw tightened. He was cornered. Julia smiled, a slow, satisfied expression. "Happy anniversary, love." Daniel exhaled shakily, understanding that his reign had come to an end. He had underestimated Julia. And now, he was paying the price. As Julia and Adrian walked out of the restaurant, the night air felt different, lighter, freer. The illusion was shattered, but from the fragments, she had built something far stronger. She had been the betrayed. But now? Now, she was the one who won the game. To be continued. Whispers of betrayal. The air inside the dimly lit bedroom was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and deceit. Claire sat at the edge of the bed, her fingers tracing the soft silk of her robe, her mind clouded with guilt and anticipation. The clock on the nightstand glowed 11:45 p.m. 15 minutes before Daniel would arrive. Her husband, Mark, was out of town on a business trip. He had called her earlier that evening, his voice tired but filled with love. "I miss you, Claire," he had said. "I'll be home in 2 days. I can't wait to see you." Guilt twisted in her stomach, but not enough to stop her. Not enough to cancel the text she had sent earlier. "Come over. Same time." Daniel was already on his way. 2 years earlier. Claire and Mark had what others would call the perfect marriage. He was a successful entrepreneur, devoted and loving. She was the graceful, charming wife who hosted dinner parties and smiled for the camera. Their life was picturesque: a grand house, luxury vacations, and whispered laughter over candlelit dinners. But perfection was fragile, and secrets had a way of slipping through the cracks. It started with stolen glances across crowded rooms. Daniel was Mark's business partner, a man of effortless charm and quiet intensity. At first, it had been innocent: a conversation here, a joke there. Then came the accidental touches, the late-night texts, the excuses to meet. One evening, after a corporate gala, Claire had lingered too long by the balcony, the city lights reflecting in her wine glass. Daniel had found her there, his voice low, his presence intoxicating. "Tell me to walk away, Claire," he had murmured. She hadn't. Present day. A knock at the door pulled Claire from her thoughts. She hesitated for only a second before opening it. Daniel stepped inside, his dark eyes locking onto hers. There was no need for words. He cupped her face, his lips capturing hers in a kiss that erased everything else: her guilt, her fear, her love for Mark. Their affair had become a carefully orchestrated routine. Always at her house, always on nights when Mark was away, always erasing any evidence before morning. But routines bred complacency. And complacency was dangerous. Neither of them noticed the small, blinking red light on the bookshelf. A sudden reckoning. 2 days later, Mark came home earlier than expected. Claire greeted him with a forced smile, her heart pounding as she tried to act normal. But something was off. His kiss lingered too long. His gaze held something unreadable. "You were home the whole time, right?" he asked, his tone casual but his eyes sharp. "Of course," she said, laughing lightly. "Why?" He didn't answer. Instead, he walked to the living room, grabbed the remote, and turned on the TV. The screen flickered to life. Claire's breath caught in her throat. The footage was grainy but unmistakable: her and Daniel, together, in their bedroom. Her world tilted as Mark turned to her, his expression unreadable. "How long?" She opened her mouth, but no words came. The weight of her betrayal crashed down upon her, crushing her. She had been careful. She had covered every trace. Except one. Mark had installed hidden cameras. The consequences of betrayal. Silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken fury and heartbreak. Mark inhaled sharply, his fists clenching at his sides. "I loved you, Claire. I gave you everything." Tears streamed down her face. "Mark, Don't," he cut her off. "Don't insult me with excuses." She reached for him, but he stepped back. The man she had loved, the man she had deceived, was gone. In his place was a stranger. "You need to leave," he said quietly. Claire's heart shattered. "Mark, please." He shook his head. "Get out." She packed a bag in silence, her hands trembling. As she walked past him, she dared to meet his eyes one last time. There was no love left in them. Only the echoes of a trust that could never be rebuilt. 1 month later. Claire had lost everything: her home, her husband, the life she had taken for granted. Daniel had disappeared, unwilling to face the wreckage they had caused. She sat alone in a small apartment, staring at her phone. A message from an unknown number appeared on the screen. "You thought betrayal had no price? You were wrong. This isn't over." A chill ran down her spine. She looked around, suddenly feeling the weight of unseen eyes watching. And somewhere, in the shadows, someone was waiting for the final move. The Web of Lies. Chapter 1. A Perfect Illusion. Charlotte Williams had always been the epitome of grace and poise. A successful interior designer, married to the charming and accomplished lawyer, Benjamin Williams, they seemed to have the perfect life. Their home was a spacious estate in the suburbs, their social circle filled with wealthy, influential people. On paper, they were the ideal couple, one that everyone envied. But appearances can be deceiving. Charlotte often wondered when her marriage had started to crack. At first, it was small things: long hours Benjamin spent at work, the late-night phone calls that sometimes went unanswered, the subtle hints of disinterest in her attempts to engage in conversation. She tried to convince herself that it was just the pressures of work, the demands of their busy lives. But deep down, she knew something was off. Their relationship had gone from fiery passion to cold indifference, and she found herself living in a world where loneliness was more frequent than affection. Benjamin, her loving husband of 10 years, seemed to be slipping away from her, bit by bit. Chapter 2. The Stranger's Touch. One night, as Charlotte returned home early from a client meeting, she found Benjamin sitting on the couch in their living room, his head buried in his phone. When he looked up, his eyes were distant, far away, almost unreadable. "Hey, how was your day?" she asked, hoping for some connection, some glimpse of the man she once knew. "Busy. You know how it is," he replied curtly, his eyes flicking back to the screen. Charlotte felt a pang of disappointment but pushed it down. She decided to ignore the sinking feeling in her stomach. Maybe it was just a bad day. They all had them, right? The following evening, Charlotte decided to break away from her routine and go out. She needed a change of scenery, something different to escape the monotony of her marriage. So, she ventured to a trendy bar in the city, something she would never have considered before. It was there that she met him, Alexander. He was everything Benjamin wasn't: spontaneous, charming, and attentive. Alexander had a way of making Charlotte feel seen, making her feel desired in a way Benjamin hadn't in months. It was all so innocent at first: a few casual conversations over drinks, some flirtatious smiles, and before she knew it, their exchanges became more frequent. Charlotte had never thought she would be unfaithful, but Alexander had a magnetic presence that she couldn't resist. He didn't have the cold, distant look Benjamin wore. Instead, he had the warmth she desperately craved. They had kissed. Just once. But it felt like an awakening. Chapter 3. Crossing the Line. After that night, Charlotte found herself unable to forget about Alexander. He would text her, they would talk for hours. She told herself it was harmless, just an escape, something to keep her distracted from her failing marriage. But deep down, she knew she was playing with fire. The secret meetings became more frequent. They would meet for coffee during the day, for drinks at night. Alexander always seemed to know the right thing to say, the right way to make her feel important. He listened to her when Benjamin hadn't. He made her feel alive again, something she hadn't felt in years. One evening, as the evening rain drummed against the windows of the coffee shop, Alexander took her hand and looked into her eyes. "You know what this is, Charlotte," he said softly, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. "This isn't just some fling. It's real. I want you, and I know you want me." Charlotte's heart raced. She knew it was wrong, but at that moment, she couldn't help herself. The truth was, she hadn't truly felt wanted in such a long time. And here was Alexander, making her feel like the center of his world. It felt like an escape from the hollow, mechanical existence she shared with Benjamin. A week later, Charlotte made a choice. She had already crossed the line emotionally, and now, with Alexander, she would cross it physically. One night, they met at her apartment. Benjamin had been working late, as usual, and Charlotte had no intention of waiting around anymore. They made love in a way she hadn't in years, with intensity, passion, and a sense of freedom. In that moment, Charlotte felt like a different woman. But as the morning light filtered through the blinds the next day, the weight of what she had done began to set in. Guilt flooded her, but it was quickly pushed aside by the fleeting exhilaration of the night before. She couldn't stop now. Chapter 4. The Unraveling. Charlotte's double life continued for months. She juggled her husband, who remained blissfully ignorant of her infidelity, with Alexander, whose touch became her addiction. The lies piled up: white lies, black lies, omissions, all of them stacking higher as each day passed. She was careful, meticulous, but with each lie, her guilt grew heavier. But Benjamin was no fool. He wasn't blind, nor was he completely indifferent. He noticed things. The way Charlotte had become more distant, the way she would disappear for hours, the odd hours when she would come home late or not at all. Benjamin began to investigate, quietly, in his own way. He was a lawyer, after all, trained to notice the smallest discrepancies. He started paying attention to the little things: a missed phone call here, a subtle shift in her behavior there. Then one day, as he went through their shared computer, he found something that made his heart stop: a series of texts between Charlotte and Alexander. The messages were harmless at first, just friendly banter. But they escalated quickly. And one particular message was damning. "I miss you. I can't wait to see you again. I feel like I'm suffocating without you." Benjamin sat frozen for a long time. His mind raced, trying to make sense of the betrayal. His wife, the woman he had loved, the woman he had trusted, had betrayed him in the worst way possible. Chapter 5. Confrontation. That evening, Benjamin came home earlier than usual. He found Charlotte in the kitchen, making dinner, her back turned to him. "Charlotte," he said softly, his voice carrying an edge that made her stiffen. She turned, startled. "Ben, you're home early," she said, forcing a smile. "I need to talk to you," he replied, his eyes dark. "Now." Charlotte's stomach turned as she sensed the impending confrontation. "About what?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Benjamin didn't waste time with pleasantries. He pulled out his phone and showed her the text message. Her face drained of color as she read the words she had hoped he would never find. "I can explain," she whispered, but the words seemed empty. "You don't need to," Benjamin said, his voice cold. "I think I understand everything now." The truth has a way of revealing itself, Charlotte. And you're no longer the woman I married. Chapter 6. The Consequences. Charlotte was left standing there, her heart racing as Benjamin walked out the door, leaving her alone with her guilt, her shame, and the life she had broken. In the days that followed, she tried to salvage what was left of her marriage, but it was too late. Benjamin filed for divorce, and though she fought to explain, to make him understand, it was clear that the damage was done. Alexander, too, disappeared. He was just a fleeting moment in her life, a whirlwind of excitement that she could never go back to. The consequences of her actions were far-reaching. Not only had she lost the love of her life, but she also lost herself in the process.